Welcome back, everybody. I'm Gammatrap. Hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to be looking at how to paint metal. Now there's a couple different ways to do it, and there's the stylized way, and then there's the more realistic way, and both are awesome depending on the type of piece you're making. However, the piece we're going to be working on right now is more of the stylized kind of way, and it mostly has to do with how to render the lighting and the color and make it look like a real metal texture. Now metal is very reflective, so it depends completely around the environment of where the metal is, but we'll get into that in a bit. Here's pretty much what it's going to look like and what I'm going to walk you through. You can see here that the metal is reflecting the color of the surroundings, the various types of surroundings it's got, and there's this really interesting sheen that I really like to do in regards to how it reflects the light. So we're going to go over the best ways to do it, but here's the starting piece. This is essentially what it looks like right now, and that's what we're going to work on. So, if we're going to take a look at a couple of examples, we've got this piece. It's one of my other pieces, Fury of the Mountain. Now, this piece, the metal in it, it's not very detailed. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, it's detailed in like one way. If you look here, you can see that it's detailed. I've got some engravings and some markings, but other than that, it's almost bland. In some way, but the rest of the piece kind of makes up for it because I've got all this stuff going on. But next piece I've got is a different, sort of almost different type of rendering of the metal. And this is just like armor of a dude. One of my favorite things to do with stylized metal is to handle the reflection in an interesting way. Like normally, if you have a cylinder made of metal, like a Coke can, it's going to have a reflective line, just a line, boring, plain, ordinary line of light wherever the light source is in every direction, and we'll discuss that in a second. But if we look, instead of doing the typical line, I like to do this kind of like wavy, kind of interesting shapes, like whipping, and sound effects. By the way, I think, in my opinion, are perfectly reasonable and maybe even should be expected. But let's get back into this. Now, this is just a random shape. Kind of, it could be a piece of armor from like a shoulder or an elbow or even a knee. It's just boring at the moment. I just wanted to put the shape in there and some basic detail. And when I say detail, I mean like, it's got that curve and, it's got some attachments, maybe leather, maybe different type of, painted metal. So let's get into doing this big actual piece of metal now that the intros are out of the way. Now, the way metal works, the first thing you got to think about is, say for example, we've got a Coke can, right? It's a cylinder, so if you flip it over on its side, it's going to look like this. It goes around, and if you stand it up, it's going to be like this. The way light is going to react to it is it's going to have shadowy parts and lighter parts. So one of the easiest things to do to make metal, and if you want to just skip this entire video, be my guest right after this point, okay? Feel free to experiment on your own. I don't want to try and sway someone's style one way or the other. If you'd like to try and just explore on your own, just get the basics and then go. Perfectly fine with that. But here's one of the biggest things I could add to this tutorial that might increase the value a little bit of your metal right here. Now, the main point of light reflecting off metal, if you look back at the Coke can, is light follows the direction of the metal. Now, that can be a little confusing, and if you look at the Coke can, you'll think, yeah, but the metal's going this way. And you'd be right, all right? But the direction of the metal is like this. It's vertical. So this isn't necessarily the direction of the metal. That's just how it's bent. That's just how it's curved. And this is going to be one of the most confusing parts, especially when a complex piece like this. But let's look at this real quick. The metal comes down like this, comes out like that, comes down like this, then comes down like that, and comes down like that. Kind of see what I'm saying? The light is coming from, say, up here. So we are going to just assume that the light's going to come down and hit one good huge chunk of the metal. And it can't follow the metal around like this, right? If the light's coming from one point, it's going to hit one spot in the metal, because light radiates from a source, and it's going to hit all of the metal, but it's going to be reflected back from, if it's curved, one side, one section. So we've got the curve, we've got the light coming down, and it's going to hit right there. It's not going to come all the way around. It's going to go bing. Now, depending on where your eyes are, it's going to go like straight to you. Now, the good news is it also hits other things, same thing like sonar. So if it comes over here and hits this, it'll bounce down and it'll have another smaller reflection, and that's the bounce light, and we'll get more into that in a second. So I know this is super confusing and it's a lot to think about, but the more you practice, the easier it's going to be. Just start with the main piece, right? Let's go with just the main piece of metal. So let's clean this up a bit so you have a little more room to work. If we need, I'll do some more illustrations, which I probably will. So let's assume, judging from the environment that we've made, and we could not having to use this environment at all, but we're probably going to use both this gray and the colored version to show different how metal reacts to its environment. Because aside from water and mirrors, metal is almost the most reflective thing out there. So it's going to react and almost act as a mirror to a certain extent. It's going to have a lot of reflections. Take, for example, this guy's legs are both covered in these metal platings. But here's one leg and here's another. And if you look right here, there's a reflection of this leg on that leg, because metal is very reflective. And I'll bring this piece up more often to show like all the different types of light reflections, and you can kind of see my point from earlier. If you see one part of this guy's helmet is nice and reflective, same as this curve, and I kind of went ahead and did both ways for this one because there's so much light bouncing around anyway. We got this and we've got that, which usually I would suggest not to do that. It can get really muddy really quick. But the basic way is if the helmet's curved like this, essentially kind of like that, it's muddy, but we'll go with it. That means that a slash like this is going to be, where the reflection is. And now also it works the same way with the rest of these, pieces of armor. We've got the arm here that curves like this. So that means that the reflections are going to be following the direction of the metal. Now the reflections are either going to be white, depending on the light source, or they're going to be red, or whatever color the light source is. Below this guy is a bunch of lava and fire, so it's fair to say that the reflections are going to be rather red, quite warm. So onto the shoulder bit. I'm going to make this a clipping mask so that everything we do is going to stay isolated to that piece that we did, the shape, essentially, below. So just like the Coke can, we're just going to make that brush way softer. And I'm just using a black brush real quick, a nice soft black brush, and we're just going to grab kind of the edges, just like that. You can almost sort of see how the metal's taking shape and how it's bending, right? Just with that simple shading on the sides. If we continue on, now let's grab that actual blue right there, make it a little darker, and start brushing this in a little bit. So just like the light part of, let's say, the Coke can, just like it has a beam of light, it also has reflections of the darker things in its environment. And some could argue this is actually the true color of the metal, but they're not everywhere. let's add the lighter reflection. And this is pretty much how I start all my metal pieces. Now what's funny is, if you ask every artist, just about, they'll say that they have like one or two favorite things they love to work on because it's like maybe therapeutic or whatever their reason is. Mine, like for example, Dave Greco says he likes to work on hair because he just loves how he loves rendering the hair. It's all flowy and he likes making the different shapes and stuff. Mine, it's metal, so you came to the right place. So now also, if we look at our Coke can here, I'm going to come back to this Coke can a lot most likely. This lip here, this rim, because it's the edge of the metal, the very edge of almost every piece of metal, it's extremely reflective because its corner is so precise. It almost doesn't matter wherever you look. If you're coming this way, that way, that way, that way, or this way, wherever your eyes are, this corner has a side facing you. So because of that, the edges of metal things are often very reflective. So that's something to keep in mind, and we can use that to really help sell the idea that we're painting metal. So on the reflective parts, you add a little extra edge. Same with over here. Now generally, because this entire corner here is pretty much just a bend in the metal, a very sharp bend, almost the whole thing gets a nice reflective bit. Now, depending on how used the metal piece you're making is, most metal pieces, in fact, are often pretty worn down because it's not perfect. Almost no metal is impervious to anything. So keeping that in mind, there's going to be scratches and stuff on the surface, and we'll get more into other types of scratches in a second, but when you're doing this edge work here, something I love to do is while I'm making these edges, I'll add little bumps and nicks. Kind of like this. Now we know the light's over here, so that means that the reflection on the edge of the piece of metal is going to be most prominent right here. So I'm doing these bumps. The ones away, farther away from our light line here, are going to be a little dimmer than the ones that are closer to it, which are almost perfectly white because the light reflecting is so strong. We're just going to find all the little edges of every little thing that we want to highlight. And that kind of involves almost every edge. Now, you got to be careful with this, otherwise you're going to end up highlighting everything. So it needs to be pretty subtle at some point. And you'll see me, redoing lines and stuff from time to time. Now we can go ahead and say that this stuff down here is like more like leather. These darker spots. We'll probably paint them in better later too. So when they're making this piece, let's say that there's a lip right there. There we go. It's gonna be pretty subtle, but there's probably one right there as well where the metal bends. Kind of like that. And we'll blend this in a little better later. Okay, that's a good start. Let's actually make this part back here a little darker. This edge doesn't need to be so sharp. Okay, so we took our original shape, we applied some basic, super basic, light and dark. Just a little bit of highlights, a little bit of low. And then now we can start actually probably doing some decent little blending on it. And also, depending on where the metal is bent, makes you get more or less shade. I want that to be kind of like a little bit of a lip right there, like a dragon wing. And because this spot right here, if the light's coming from above, coming down, that means the part near the top here that's being bent in is going to be a little darker than the part in the bottom. That's good enough. Okay, so now let's start doing the really fun part. And this is making my my squiggles, my interesting little squiggle bits. I don't know if that's an expression I want to be tied to, squiggle bits, but let's just call it what it is. So first, we're going to make these light lines a little more prominent. Now that we know exactly where we want them. There we go. Now it's really bright, as you can tell. But, here we go. Check us out. If we grab, say, the color right next to our light here. If we grab that color, for example, and we just kind of start chipping into it. Grab the other color. And we're going to grab the color that it's sort of becoming. See how it's turning from this light color to this darker color? We're going to grab that middle bit right there and we're going to start blending it in. Now the way blending works is you grab one color and you start pushing it into another color, and you grab that color and start pushing it back. And you grab the middle color that they both create and you start pushing both sides until it's this nice flow from one color to another. There we go. We can lighten up this side over here a bit more, so you have a little more room to push. And now, because the metal is a hard surface, it's not too soft, we're gonna grab that darker color, we're gonna chop into this. Give it sort of this little lip. Kind of like that. So you can see how it's already starting to have a more interesting look to it with that little the squiggle bit. I gotta stop saying that. I'm gonna get in trouble. But when we add this interesting reflection, instead of just this boring line would be more realistic. But when you give it a little more flair on the reflection, it gives, I think, the piece maybe a little more life. We sort of just cut into one side and cut into another, and we try to make sure it kind of bends the line a little bit. So that makes it a little more stylized. Now that's not all we have to do, because the way reflections of light work typically on most surfaces, there's going to be a little more spread, a little more diffusion of the light. So the way we do that is we grab the light source, make our brush nice and big, and we gently just give a little push. Kind of like that. And then we can start blending that in a bit, nice and subtle. Now we have the shape we want. We don't have to worry too much about it. We just gotta make sure it has a nice, even movement from the light color to the dark. Kind of like that. There we go. So now you see this really nice diffusion. And so we're going to do this on just these other two parts up here, or three technically. Let's find a way that we want to give this some cuts. Now if we cut both sides evenly, we're going to end up with a line again, which we don't want. So sometimes it's a good idea to prematurely, when you're adding the lines, instead of just a basic white line coming down here to here, to give a little flair of its own. So now when we're cutting into it, it already sort of has an interesting shape. Give a little more girth, a little more substance. And in doing this, we're going to move the line around probably a lot, but you're going to try and find that one special sweet spot to where it looks really cool. Now, in most cases, and this is no exception, less is often more. So you don't want to make a line that's going like, you know. So if it gets too crazy, I want to button it up a little bit. You know, tighten up the line a bit. Kind of like that a bit. Let's go a little closer in. Straighten it out just a bit. Now also when I like to do this, I enjoy having the tops and the bottoms of these reflections have these, you know, it extends a lot on both sides, like from here to there, almost like a capital I. Okay, so now let's blend this out a bit. Give it that lip. And now let's gently blend the lighter parts outward away from the light source. And then we'll blend that one final time, and that piece will be good. Now if you want, you totally can just have your light source or your reflections on the metal be just sharp and no blending, you know, no softening. It's completely up to you. That's pretty good. Let's make this line bend down a little bit more. Cool. Okay. Now we're going to go down here to this one. Same rules apply. I'm going to have it bend probably like that. Oh yeah, this one was way faster. less experimentation. Looks pretty good. Looks like an M. Let's make sure that the fidelity of this bottom lip stays pretty true. There we go. And now we can just start blending. So the more we do it, less I have to explain it, so the faster we get. I'm just changing the size of my brush from time to time, making sure I've got a nice variation. Makes the process go by a little faster. And a lot of people are like, oh man, what brushes do you use? I use so many different types of brushes. For a lot of my work, I like to try and just use basic, ordinary Photoshop brushes. But I've got some brushes from other artists like Eitan Zana and like the aforementioned Dave Greco. For example, the one I'm using right now is his DG main brush, which he actually offers for free, lucky you. If you go check out Dave Greco's videos, which by the way are pretty awesome, very informative. He's a cool dude doing cool dude stuff. Here we go. And now last shape. We're gonna have this one do the opposite. Have this one go from over here to down here. You can absolutely have all of your reflections behave completely the same. But for just the way I like to do things, me personally, I like having some variation. And we'll blend the light part out. Making sure that the colors gently move from one side to the other. And you can do this with soft brushes, you can do this with hard brushes, wet brushes, dry brushes, air brushes, it really doesn't matter. As long as you experiment and try and find a good way that works. Here we go. Now, the main sources, the main reflections on this metal piece are now pretty much done. My last little stylized little swooshes and I don't know what you would call them, but little check marks, my little slashes. But you might notice there's a couple other, lines here to consider. For example, we've got this darker area here. Now it'll work the exact same way on the dark parts of the metal. So let's get into that a bit. Let's see what's going on here. Grab the dark part and we give it an interesting shape to start with. Kind of like this. And we'll just do the same thing we did with the light part. We'll just cut into it. We'll try and find a cool way to show off that dark part. Then you do the blending. Then you soften up the area a little bit. And you make sure above and beyond to follow the rules of the material that you've given yourself. So for example, this one has that little lip right there. Let's just clean that edge up a bit. Blend the color out. This one didn't need too much because we already had a lot of the area blended. How many times I've said blend? So many times in my life have I used the word blend. It's wrong every time, I will add, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it's kind of fun to say. Okay, now we get the lower shapes. We just kind of follow along our predetermined sort of shape that we set for ourselves. Now what's cool about metal is sometimes it gets pitted. Now the term pitted means when rust or something else digs into metal. And that's what happens when you see those metal with those it's like pock marks everywhere, right? Almost like the metal has acne. Like cast iron stoves. It's a fantastic example. That's when there's pitting. So it makes little pits. See what I'm saying? See what they did there? It's not me. Don't blame me. It's not my term. That's the term. Pitted. So you don't have, if you got the, depending on the brush, you really don't have to clean up the blending too much. See, for example, this brush has a little bit of a texture to it. It's perfectly fine to just keep it that way if you want. A little more dark over here on this side. There we go. Okay, so now we're seeing a much more, you could say, living piece of metal. It's more, not only is it reacting to a more natural lighting scenario, but it also has some stylized reflections of light involved, which makes it, I think, a little more interesting to look at and more fun to do, honestly. It's one of the reasons I love doing metal so much, especially in this particular style. So let's clean this up a little more. We've got the basic shape, we've got the basic reflections, we've got pretty much all the groundwork taken care of. So you can see we started with just the basic shape, and then we added the lighting, essentially, and how it reacts to lighting. Now this is just white and the kind of blue that was already there. So it fits really well in this scenario. where it's just gray, nothing really going on. But we add the more brown, like sand or dirt, and then I've also had this little whoosh, little shot of light just to give us more stuff to play with. Let's make it react to its current scenario now. Now it's got color beneath it and around it. And when there's metal with color beneath it and around it, you've got to make it respond to that. For example, with this one here, there was color beneath the metal, and it has to respond to that, especially seeing as the color beneath it is a light source. That's a big one. Metal responds very intensely to light sources because it's so reflective. Now this is only going to have to worry about bounce light. So the light comes down, hits the dirt or the sand, and bounces up. And what it bounces up as is pretty much the color of whatever's around here. So let's add a new layer. Let's grab that. So because the light's coming down, hitting the sand, we'll call it sand, hitting the sand and bouncing back up, it's going to be on the underside of the metal. Doesn't necessarily have to be very uniform. But you just gotta make sure it reacts properly. So we gave that part right there a bit of a sandy tint to it. So the underside of every piece of metal, or the outside, depending on if it's going to get much direct access to the environment, it's going to react with a little bit of bounce light. Say it's a nice solid plane right there. It's a flat part. Now, remember how we said this wing here, this little lip, kind of starts right here, dips in, and comes out? The spot right here is in the shadow, but because it's not facing the light source, but it is facing the bounce light. So that means we need to give it some reflections that depict the direction that it's facing. See what I'm saying? It's kind of cool. And we'll have to make sure that we blend this properly because it has a little bit of a curve to it. It's not going to just go from straight one color to the other. Because there's that curve in the middle, blending right here is pretty much necessary. And because we got that lip there, we have another opportunity to make this edge a little rough. Don't want to make too uniform. Make little dashes and dots, almost like Morse code. You can clean it up by painting the color on the side a bit. Never be afraid of the pixels. You are in control. If you mess up, just paint over it. It's just like real paint. Still find it funny how some people don't consider this painting. If you haven't run into that yet, you will. There's people out there that are like, yeah, but it's not paint. You're not painting if it's not paint. It's just a term for the techniques, bruh. Just a term for the techniques. And we're going to turn this a bit so it's easier on my hands. I'm getting old. Give us a nice blending. Now, it's easy to blend with a soft brush, so let's just do that real quick. Drop the opacity a bit. It's just harder to control the edges. So we grab the color we want. See how easy that is? With a soft brush. Nice smooth transitions. Perfectly possible. But see what happens there? The edge is hard to control. So you gotta make sure you know exactly how you handle your brushes to do soft brush work very well. Alright, back to the hard brush. Let's grab that color. Give the backside a bit of love. That's all backside should get, I think. And then finally this little lip that we made. Trying to get that line just right. That's good. Good enough. Good start. Good work. High fives. High fives all around. Huddle up. I played sports. Actually, I did play some sports. But I mostly did band and powerlifting. Okay, so now we've got the basic reflections of the basic environment. So, if you would like, you could also consider if, for example, if this is not just a flat plane and, you know, the sand goes up on hills or whatever around the piece of metal on the ground, it's also not far-fetched to assume that it can be reflected up like that. And this is something that I really enjoy doing. Because remember, this side is facing down compared to the rest of the armor. So it's going to get a lot of color reflection. A lot of bounce light. You put some right there, just in the dark spots, make it look really cool. Get some right there, not too much, just a little bit, because this part right here and this part, they're all facing up, so they don't get as much bounce light as another part that's facing to the side or down. Let's make it a little brighter. That's pretty good. And we'll blend this a bit. What's great is the more realistic the piece is, the more you have to worry about it. But if you're doing a stylized piece, it's really up to you how you like to, how much level of detail you're willing to put into something. Which sort of, you know, makes this whole thing a little more worthwhile, I think. If you see me saving, that just means that I've been hurt before. All right, look at that. Not bad. Not too shabby. Now, the last step. Now, if we take away the scene and that light, it still looks cool, as you can see. It still looks awesome by itself. It doesn't quite make as much sense because we got the bounce light from nowhere, apparently. So if we, you know, put the stuff back, it makes way more sense, obviously. But now let's focus on some really cool detail. Something you might have noticed, as we were talking about a bit earlier, is little grooves, little hatches, you know, little cuts into the metal that we talked about. We're going to expand a bit more on that. This is one of the things that really sell the piece. Like, oh, that's armor, that's metal for sure. Because if we grab the lightest part of the metal and we grab the darkest part of the metal, because this part's going to be pretty intense. So we're going to grab the light part, make sure our brush is on pressure sensitivity, and we're going to just give it some of these little dings, just to start with. Just for start. And make sure that these dings follow the direction of the metal. So if metal does this, make sure the dings do that too, little grooves. And we're just giving this arm a little bit of flavor, you know? Keep in mind pretty much where you put these, because this is only the first bit. Once we add the highlight or the shadow, you can do whichever one you want first, honestly. We're going to add the opposite. So we're going to switch color to the darker side, and we're going to pay attention to where the light source is. Remember, if the light source is coming from up top and coming down, that means the bottom section of this little check mark is going to be light, and the top section is going to be dark. And we add these little, depending on the depth of the cut, we're going to add a little bit of dings, a little bit of grooves. Like that. These are very small, but they still apply. So the top section, if the light's coming from above, the shadow's on top. Remember that. The top section is going to get a little bit of bite. And feel free to add a couple extras, just, you know, just around. Not too much. Don't want to go crazy. Otherwise it'll take away from the overall look. And we will leave the realm of cool characterizations and just go straight into, oh, okay, that's a little too much. So, just something to keep in mind. You have to keep pressure sensitivity on at all times. In fact, most of the time whenever I work, I don't really like having pressure sensitivity on. That's just preference. But from time to time, it's kind of nice. All right, so we know that the light source is hitting right there, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make the cuts nearest to the light source a little lighter. So they're not going to be, you can probably take that off. So they're not going to be, I'm not going to have these dark grooves in as much. So we're going to get a nice soft brush, make it nice and big. Drop the opacity, drop the flow a little bit. I'm just going to add these right here. Yeah. Now, typically speaking, where the metal curves, like these corners here, or these little lips right here, or whatever, that's where the metal gets the most damage, because that's almost the corner of the pieces is almost always where it's going to hit something when it's moving, when metal's moving against other metal and, like, you know, armor, or when your sword hits a piece of metal, a piece of armor. It's mostly going to hit the corners here, and the corners typically brush up against stuff, almost like it's like your keychain. If you got a metal plate or something on your keychain, you'll notice that the edges get way more worn down. And real quick, I'm actually gonna take away a bit of this one because it's a little too much. Take away too much the love from the rest of the part. And a little bit over here. Like I said, you don't want these things to be too big and prominent, otherwise it takes away from the entire piece. But let's continue by adding a couple like that. We're gonna add some cuts, because metal often gets scraped and scratched. And I always like to start with these scratches and stuff. I always like to do the light one first and then make the shadow react to it. But it's a personal preference. By no means is gospel, so just keep that in mind. Again, we don't want to make these things too uniform. You don't want them to be too... You don't want the lines to be too thick, too thin. I'm going in random directions, pretty much. And the same, it's going to be, remember, light source is going to determine where these cuts go. Light source is going to determine where the shadow and the highlights are. And if one line is really thin, you don't want to have a really big shadow and a tiny little highlight. You want them pretty much to be the same. And every highlight and every shadow doesn't need to have a corresponding, thing to it. Like every highlight here does not need a shadow. For some of these really light ones, probably don't need it. But these kind of thicker ones, they could probably do with one. And let's lighten up the edges of this one a bit. So we can have the deep cut be near the middle of the cuts, and more shallow near the edges. All right, check it out. All right, so there you go. That is an interesting way to do stylized metal. This is just my approach on how to handle like light reflections, bounce light, and colors and whatnot for metal pieces. Again, this is stylized and not super realistic. If you look at it, clearly this is not some like hyper realistic piece of metal. And I hope that it's really cool. Hopefully it's enjoyable. That's just how I handle things. You'll probably end up handling things a little different, but if you have a view of maybe my and other artists' way of handling it, I think maybe it would give you a good boost on how to do it for yourself and make your own kind of style of armor or whatever. Hopefully you found this video useful or entertaining. Feel free to leave a like if you found it so, and comment below if you found this video helpful. That's a big one. If you didn't find the video helpful, comment below saying that you didn't. I would like a comment either way. I demand these things. Subscribe if you'd like to see more tutorials like this. I also do a lot of speed paints. Share with your friends and other artistic individuals that you think might benefit from this. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.